Oh no, I'm going to be on the YouTubes. What?
Внимание! Говорит
Oh, that's what
Москва.
it is.
Передаем важное правительственное сообщение. Московское время 8 часов. Okay, comrades and workers and peasants and other. This is our first Dom Culture. Oh my gosh. This is our first on guard meeting. This is the spiritual successor of Dom Kulturi. It's a monthly call where we gather together Red Army and Eastern European historians to try and give a little bit of insight about life in Eastern Europe during World War II, culture, history, and practical tips for historical reenactors. I am happy to present that for the first time, these are being recorded. And they will be posted on our YouTube, as well as hopefully on Facebook if we can make it work. I'm going to present here our illustrious leader, Leia, and she had some prepared speeches to give. First, our presentation today will cover the history of OSOAVIAKhIM, which is our unit, our new unit. They will also cover Red Army, or well, Soviet civilian fashion, as well as rifle drill of the Red Army. Okay, I'll pass it on to Leia.
Can anyone hear me?
Dr.
Hello,
Mandia.
everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first episode of On Guard, Eastern European Monthly. I am Yelena Kosareva, otherwise Leia Worth, the commander, head instructor, and founder of the Academia Reenacting Group, the OSOAVIAKhIM Foundation, which is a Soviet reenacting umbrella. We are proud to finally revive a community favorite talk show started by Andrei Kosarev, otherwise Andrew Worth, former Istochnik Stavka member and now our NCO trainer. We are excited to have you tune into our show tonight, and if you miss out on anything or lose connection, fear not. We will upload a recording of each of our episodes on our YouTube channel, the OSOAVIAKhIM Foundation. We will have a discussion panel at the end of each presentation, so please feel free to type your questions into the presentation room's discussion sidebar. And that being said, I would like to introduce our very first presenter, which will be Andrew Poppy.
Thank you. Let me pull up my presentation. If I can get it. All right, so I'm going to be covering OSOAVIAKhIM, and I'm just going to preface this with it's a very big subject. So I'm going to try to just cover the history of the organization, how it was actually structured, and the role it played during the war. I will not be covering experiences of those who learned under it or anything of that sort. It's going to be a simple narrative history of the organization. So I'm going to begin with the predecessors, because there's a long history of paramilitary studies in the Soviet Union, and OSOAVIAKhIM only ever came about in the late 20s. The first kind of serious study into military tactics that the Soviet Union started conducting was through the Military Science Society, VNO, which was established in the midst of the Civil War and was only for the Russian Republic. This organization was purely military, and it was based out of the Red Army Staff Headquarters. Its purpose was essentially to study the ongoing Civil War conflict, and then to, from that, propose tactical solutions and ideas for equipment. You know, it was essentially an R&D room for working out new tactics by exploring the Red Army's own history and its own experiences. By the end of this organization, it had become fully integrated into the Army. So while there was the main room in the staff headquarters, most regiments of the Red Army in the field would have had an inner circle of more academic and professionally minded men, mostly officers, who were part of that unit's VNO detachment, who were the ones that were discussing tactics and making these plans and collecting data for the larger society. Now, the VNO continued to exist until the unification of the republics into the Soviet Union, at which point, during its first all-union Congress, it was reorganized into the Society for the Assistance of the Defense of the Soviet Union, OSO. Now, OSO differed from the previous VNO not only because it was all-union, so it no longer just applied to the Russian Republic, but all of the republics in the Union. However, also, specifically Voroshilov, who was the chairman of this all-union Congress, wanted to integrate the masses. So unlike the VNO, OSO was had heavy involvement of civilians, which will be a reoccurring theme with the organization as it goes forward. Existing alongside OSO and a lot of these early organizations there was a number of friend organizations, which were civilian organizations that were either related to industry or branches of the military. Of these, there was the Friends of the Air Fleet, which was a civilian air organization that had some integration into the military, and the Chemical Defense and Industries Friend Group, which, as the name would imply, was heavily involved in chemical industries. These two were merged in 25 to form OSOAVIAKhIM, which, sort of like the new OSO, was a military integrated civilian organization that was meant to take these previously separate military civilian groups and give them an interface to actually have an impact on the military. At its first all-union Congress in 1927, it merged with OSO, originally as AVIAKhIM OSO, and then almost immediately renamed OSOAVIAKhIM. Now we have a merging of chemical defense, air defense, and general defense of the Soviet Union into one umbrella civil organization. Now, OSOAVIAKhIM, as an organization as it existed from its founding in the late 20s all the way to its dissolution in 48, was, it's important to note, distinctly separate from the government. It was not a government organization, nor was it an army organization, nor a party organization, but it had fingers of all of them within it. So the organization itself was based on general Soviet Republican ideals. So the lowest form of organization was the cell. This might be a town or a factory, industrial area of, maybe a couple hundred people to a couple thousand. And this is operated by a chairman and a treasurer, which is their co-command. And the day-to-day activities are run by a bureau of maybe 7 members of this organization. And these members have direct democratic involvement in their cell. And then they elect representatives to the higher Congress and so on, all up to the all-union Congress, which governs it from a federal level and affects every republic, every oblast, and so on. While the majority of these council members are regular OSOAVIAKhIM members, they are not solely regular OSOAVIAKhIM members. Some are active and reserve Red Army personnel. Others are representatives from the party itself or representatives from local industry who may have stake in this organization. Membership itself was nominally volunteer. It was supposed to be a volunteer democratic organization. But most of them were through the Komsomol or its affiliated organizations. So Komsomol, Pioneers, and Young Octoberists. Some members were actually paid employees of the organization. Sometimes teachers were this way, sometimes not. Or, like I said, representatives of industry, and that has to do with the whole supply chain, which I will get into later. During its founding, it numbered about 3 million members, of which about 20% were women. And by war's start, it ballooned up to 13 million members. And its instructor staff was mainly made up of what are known as active members. These are really the most dedicated of the students and regular members. So these are younger people. Some example figures I saw was one rayon had about 47,000 members, of which maybe 400 were these active. And these form the core cadre of instructors for any given region. And they are dedicated volunteer members of the organization. However, in addition to that, it was not unheard of for Red Army and NKVD personnel to give lectures or talks, as well as Civil War veterans. within the confines of the classroom, OSOAVIAKhIM is generally teaching a lot of the basic infantry skills, developing mechanized warfare tactics, teaching chemical defense. They're teaching the history of the Union's military, aviation theory, and they do have sports integration through the GTO program, which is a separate government program to give sports education. Now, in order to actually teach, they needed facilities to do this. In part, this was through the regular school system, which was fully integrated by 32. However, the OSOAVIAKhIM also ran its own facilities, which were owned by the organization itself, paid for through its own money gathering means. So these kinds of facilities ranged widely. As far as aviation, they owned glider schools, airfields. They sponsored model airplane shops, mechanical shops. They also operated a series of indoor ranges, which were owned by the organization. These were generally located inside either existing school buildings. They might be located in someone's apartment or attic. Anywhere that was approximately 20 feet wide could be could be used for hosting these. And they were generally indoors because OSOAVIAKhIM expected to train riflery year round. Most workplaces, schools, and other facilities which hosted OSOAVIAKhIM projects also would have a corner. This was essentially a billboard that was owned by the organization where they could post either announcements for meetings, classes, announcements for their lottery system, which we'll get into, or even like training publications or bulletins with very brief explanations for different chemical defense concepts. They also operated a series of different training facilities. These would be places such as training points. This is sort of like corners in the sense that a workplace might dedicate a space in its building as a training point. And this might be, for example, at a chemical plant, they might have a training point specifically for chemical defense. And this is a place OSOAVIAKhIM could host their classes on the subject. In addition, OSOAVIAKhIM would own buildings themselves, known as houses. These were generally very local, so a cell might own a house, or a rayon might own a house, a rayon level Congress. And these were used not only for training, but also storage of the organization's equipment for that region. And then they would also, on the larger level, they owned their own independent schools. So this might be a school facility which is only dedicated to OSOAVIAKhIM programs, as opposed to the regular Soviet school system, which might also host OSOAVIAKhIM classes. The students, as mentioned before, were generally part of Komsomol or other Communist Party organizations, and they could start as young as 8 with learning the basics of military drill, chemical defense, and so on, with shooting instruction beginning at the age of 13. Generally, shooting instruction was done with 22s, though things like the Voroshilov marksmanship badge would only be able to be applied for through shooting military rifles, so full power Mosin rifles. Anyone younger than that would be part of OSOAVIAKhIM through the Young Friends of OSOAVIAKhIM, which kind of like the Young Octoberists is a child branch off of the main organization. Outside of the classroom, though, the OSOAVIAKhIM are also sponsoring numerous civilian clubs. So most notably, these are aviation and sport shooting. Aviation took the form of racing, general aviation clubs for civil aircraft, people who just enjoyed flying, as well as racing and other aviation competition. Sport shooting, similarly, but even was involved in international competitions. Aviation, some notable aviation competition teams that the OSOAVIAKhIM actually sponsored was Motherland, which was an Arctic overflight, and I believe they landed on the Arctic Circle, which was an all-woman pilot team. Nina Komarov made a record-breaking parachute jump in, I believe that's 1936. Mikhail Zurin, gas-powered model aircraft, broke an international record at 21 kilometers in 38. OSOAVIAKhIM was a stratosphere flight balloon. It unfortunately ended in disaster. 3 were killed. And then also sponsored SSR V6, which was a Soviet airship that rivaled the Hindenburg contemporarily, before it also ended in disaster, killing all on board. Outside of competition and civilian clubs, however, they also had military life outside the classroom, and this took primarily two forms. So first off, OSOAVIAKhIM operated camps, and these are essentially like kind of like Boy Scout camps where for a few weeks a group would go, and these were both leisure in the sense that the members would play sports, but also were actively drilling as a reflection of their experiences in the classroom. So war games, competitive shooting amongst each other, assault courses, that sort of material. They also existed in through paramilitary formations. So a group of OSOAVIAKhIM would be organized into platoons and companies and so on, and often led by active or reserve Red Army personnel. And then these organizations would then actively participate in Red Army exercises and war games, or were active in actual air defense for the region. So at least during the wartime, for example, an OSOAVIAKhIM class might be actively on anti-aircraft guns in a region. Now, as I said, the organization itself was entirely or officially divorced from the government and military, and as such, it had to actually fund itself. And it did this through a number of means. One, it ran its own lotteries, and you can find examples of these all over the place. It was a pay-in lottery. A certain amount was paid out, but then the remainder were taken as profit for the organization. Snab OSOAVIKhIM was a technically separate entity. It essentially existed as a middleman with industrial producers and would mainly provide the equipment to the unit. So if a Raycon level organization wanted to purchase rifles for its programs, it would do through Snab OSOAVIKhIM, which would then purchase directly from the producers. It retained its independence, but it was formed primarily from industrial concerns as well as OSOAVIKhIM members, and would basically be a money middleman between production and the actual use by classes. Much like the paramilitary formations went out and performed military duty, there were also teams within OSOAVIKhIM that were dedicated to labor and production duties. So these teams would be groups of OSOAVIKhIM members, and they performed mostly economic duties. So they might, if they were pilots, for example, training to be pilots, they might be involved in crop dusting for local farmers. They also might be involved in, if they were shooters, in pest control. And they would do this as both a training method, but also as a means of making some money for the organization. And finally, the organization was involved in numerous economic enterprises. There was a publishing house that would release literature, both defense-related and entertainment-wise. There was film production, film sponsorship. They sometimes illegally distilled vodka, and also operated what were called defense fields, essentially cultivation. They would grow whatever crops necessary, and all of this was generally done within the teaching facilities. So they were teaching, and on the side had some sort of business, because they're getting support from the army and the state, but they have to be somewhat self-sustaining. During the war itself, OSOAVIAKhIM kind of falls to the wayside, with just kind of the reality of needing larger scale training. So a lot of its facilities get ceded to Vezobuch, which is established in 1941. It has no actual connection to OSOAVIKhIM, but it takes up its mantle and is in essence its spiritual successor. This organization, its whole purpose is compulsory training for civilians. All males 16 to 60 participate, most females, and it adopts many of the practices of OSOAVIKhIM. However, its goal is not only making Red Army-men, but also developing a baseline of knowledge for civilians. In the event their territory gets taken over, they can begin partisan operations. So Vesiovuch, while not OSOAVIKhIM, takes on most of its roles during the war itself. In the aftermath of the war, however, it's dissolved. You no longer need compulsory paramilitary organizations. So OSOAVIAKhIM then takes up the mantle again. However, it itself is later dissolved in 48 and split into multiple organizations, which all kind of continue to take up the same role and function, though one is dedicated specifically to Army, one to Fleet, one to Air, and then is yet again merged in 51 to form DOSEF, which more or less takes on the same role and existed until the fall of the Soviet Union, where it now exists in some form in most of the former republics. And that is a brief history of OSOAVIAKhIM, as well as its organization and its function.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. That was a very informative presentation. Packed a lot of information into a pretty short time. Does anybody have any questions? Okay.
Feel free to unmute yourselves.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourselves. I think it's interesting that the you said SSSR VS6 or something, the also
The
OSOAVIAKhIM
airship.
airship to rival the Hindenburg also got fired and lost all lives on board.
I believe it was lost in a storm, but yeah, it was also a disaster.
Hmm,
What a shame. What a rotten way to die.
yeah, also
Yeah, because a
OSOAVIAKhIM
big part of the
in
organization was
balloons.
pushing the boundaries for industry as well. So they sponsored things like high-speed racing planes and airships and high-altitude balloons as a means of both pushing Soviet industry as well as attaining records for the Soviet government in various aviation federations and such.
But yeah, I hope that you guys can see why we've kind of chosen this as our training platform to do training events, as well as how it fits nicely into our theme of like snipers, as well as partisan warfare. It's a very interesting organization. It's one that I'd heard of a few times in research in the past few years, but our deep dive into it really showed us a whole bunch of information about this organization that it's really cool. It's really unheard of by a lot of historians. Okay.
I mean, I must admit, I never heard of it. But then again, you know me.
I think Bob Campbell has a question.
Yeah. We can't hear you if you're
Oh,
yeah,
Bob,
we can't hear
sorry,
you,
I hear
Bob.
you.
Bob, we can't hear you.
You might have to go to your voice and video settings, like right click on the microphone button. It doesn't like to use the actual device that you can use. It likes to go to a default setting.
Yeah, that's downside of Discord, I'm afraid.
Can you hear me
Yep,
now?
now we can
Now
hear
we
you.
hear you.
Perfect.
Yes, we can hear you now.
I was going to say that my wife and I love all things Soviet aviation, and Andy and I have bounced a bunch of ideas off each other, so we can bring. That's another reason I love this is we can bring the aviation thing to life too.
Yeah, from what I found, civilian aviation. I mean, it included glider schools. You had civilian air racing was popular, free flight, clubs of people who just enjoyed flying, but also they were big on model aircraft as a way of teaching aviation concepts to children. There are numerous photos of some pretty large model gliders and even ones with gasoline engines that were used as teaching aids. It was a big part of what OSOAVIAKhIM did in that period.
I have a question. If
Mhm.
So you said that they were sidelined during the war. I think you said Vesovubuk. I
Yeah,
don't know how to say it, but were they still active or were they just entirely kind of
it's kind of hard to find
road?
information because a lot of it kind of like I said, they fall to the wayside. But a lot of their facilities were ceded over because a lot of it's there's a lot of overlap between the two organizations.
Mhm.
But because OSOAVIAKhIM wasn't part of the state, wasn't part of the army, Visibuk kind of took up the mantle of OSOAVIAKhIM in terms of training civilians, compulsory, but also because it was itself part of the defense committee, so it was directly under government control at that point, as opposed to OSOAVIAKhIM, which, while pushed along by the government, was technically separate.
Yeah.
That in of itself was very interesting. I've never heard of an organization like that in the Soviet Union, like very organic.
I've
I can't.
seen
I think of it sort of like the same way as like the here in the U.S. like the civilian air patrol.
Yeah, if you
yeah.
want to draw comparisons, probably the most similar are things like the Civilian Air Patrol, or in Germany, the equivalent would be like the NSKK, a lot of these pre war paramilitary organizations that exist to give basic understanding to civilians about military concepts and kind of build a cadre of experienced people. So when you go to war, you don't have to teach people how to fly a plane from scratch. You have a pool of people who have worn uniforms and also understand flight concepts to draw from, or air defense, or whatever the subject matter is.
Hey, brother, as long as they're old enough to shoot a Panzerfaust, I think they're all a-okay.
But yeah, I did see some records or some sources saying that OSOAVIAKhIM continued operating marksmanship schools. Before the war, they were doing the Voroshilov shooter badges for rifle shooting and for machine gun shooting, and they did train a number of soldiers, at least in the beginning of the war, on rifle shooting and machine gun shooting to send to the front. Um,
Yeah, both these organizations coexisted. It's just kind of hard to
mhm.
find the delineation between who's doing what on that subject.
Like Lena's favorite Soviet sniper, Ludmila Pavlichenko, she learned how to shoot at an OSOAVIAKhIM marksmanship course. Um, well, she knew how to shoot a little bit prior, but um, the reason that she became a sniper is because she went with some friends to a Voroshilov shooting competition, and a few male friends, a few female friends. The male friends were saying that they were going to shoot so much better than her, and she shot better than all of them. And so, because she had I believe her father was an NKVD, she had this Voroshilov badge. She was sent to a extended marksmanship course, pulled out of college to go to it.